Hello everyone and welcome. My name's Kirsty Howie and I am the co-director of the Environment Centre of the Northern Territory, and we're delighted today to be able to host this webinar on carbon capture and storage in the context of gas developments offshore in the Northern Territory. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the Larrakia people on whose unceded lands and waters I'm speaking from, and who've had care and custodianship of these lands for many millennia. And I also want to acknowledge the Tiwi traditional owners on whose lands and waters Santos's proposed Barossa project is meant to traverse. And both of these groups have been caught up in the Federal and Northern Territories' plans for a gas-fired future for Australia and for the Northern Territory. With the focus on the Beetaloo Basin in recent years, it can be easy to lose sight of the fact that the Northern Territory is already a gas jurisdiction. In the early 80s, the Mereenie oil fields were opened up for exploitation. We have Impex's processing facility in Darwin Harbour that's been operating for the better part of 10 years, ENI's plant in the Bonaparte Basin, ConocoPhillips, now Santos's Darwin LNG facility in Darwin Harbour, and pipelines crisscross the Northern Territory up and down. This emphasis on gas as being the central focus of the Northern Territory's economy has only intensified, of course, with the Commonwealth and Northern Territory governments' plans for a gas-fired recovery from the COVID pandemic. And the two projects that we're particularly focusing on at the moment in the Northern Territory are Santos's toxic offshore Barossa gas project and, of course, fracking in the Beetaloo Basin. Both of these projects will create carbon bombs that will scupper our chance of meeting our obligations under the Paris Agreement and, of course, are inconsistent with the International Energy Agency's recent declaration that we can have no new oil and gas fields anywhere in the world from now if we are to avoid catastrophic climate change. So in the midst of this dire picture, many people have noticed that in recent months a new saviour has arisen from the ashes, which is carbon capture and storage. And this is being presented by many as the silver bullet that the gas industry is looking for to justify its extortionate emissions. But is it really? Today, we're delighted to have an expert panel to help us disentangle the myths and the realities of carbon capture and storage, particularly in the context of the Northern Territory. And with us, we've got Polly Hemming from the Australia Institute, Jason Fowler, Charles Shiner, and John Robert. And I'll introduce them in more detail as they speak. But we're really delighted to have their expertise and views being presented to you all today. So I'll start with introducing Polly Hemming, who is a former Darwin resident. I didn't know that. Is an advisor in the climate and energy team at the Australia Institute, and she has over 10 years experience working in policy, marketing and engagement roles for both not-for-profit and government sectors. Most recently, she led the development of a government-administered eco-label which certifies Australian businesses' voluntary climate action. She maintains a strong interest in corporate engagement and non-state climate ambition and transparency. So I'll pass over to Polly, and I'll just say, John, if you could just stop sharing your screen so that we can allow Polly to share her screen, that would be wonderful. Thank you so much. Over to you, Polly.
So much for having me. As Kirsty said, I'm an advisor in the climate and energy team at the Australia Institute and also a former Darwin resident. So I'm very happy to be here. I miss Darwin a lot, probably not this time of year. I won't make any jokes about the wet season. I'm just going to preemptively apologise because I'm here with my kids tonight and I might have to just duck out occasionally and break up fights or confiscate a shiv. I'm just going to give you an idea of where CCS fits in a federal policy context in Australia. The slide I was going to show you really tells you everything you need to know. It was a CCS display heavily branded by Santos at the Australia Pavilion at the recent UN Climate Conference in Glasgow. So while all other countries are phasing out fossil fuels or Oh, thank you, that's great. Phasing out fossil fuel, here's the Australian government with a private organisation, Kevin Gallagher, front and centre at the climate conference. So CCS is being pushed very much by the fossil fuel sector and the government, and really they're sort of one in the same at the moment. It's worth knowing that the idea of CCS, if you just want to, if you've got my presentation, if you just want to go to the slide where that, yeah, that would be great. Thank you. So this is the display. It was pretty grotesque. Sorry, I'm just working out where I was. So it's worth knowing that this idea of CCS has been dragged out again and again by previous governments as something that's fresh and new and revolutionary. If you don't mind going to the next slide, you'll see the latest positive energy campaign. You know, carbon capture and storage is this fresh new thing. It's proven safe and can permanently reduce emissions from heavy industry, which we know is not true. CCS is meant to capture CO2. Other people will talk about this, usually from an industrial source, and store it deep underground in geological reservoirs. So far from being a new low emissions technology, it's actually been around since the 70s. It was originally used for something called enhanced oil recovery, which is a practice used by oil and gas industry that involves injecting CO2 to get more oil and gas from depleted oil fields. In fact, I think about 3/4 of global projects labelled as CCS now are actually injecting CO2 into the ground to extract more oil, not to reduce emissions. So we know that CCS is used by the fossil fuel industry to justify their continued and expanded operation, and also by governments, particularly by this government, to legitimise continued support for fossil fuel industries under the false pretense of reducing emissions. So it's really just a massive loophole or a fig leaf. Even if CCS worked, it's hugely expensive. It's a distraction from proven reliable low-cost abatement measures such as rolling out renewable energy, electrification, or energy efficiency. The main proposed CCS projects in Australia, actually, I'm not sure if I'm sure everyone on this panel is aware, but most people aren't aware. Santos's Moomba CCS project, which was originally flagged for enhanced oil recovery, and a component of the Surat Basin CCS project is also for EOR. As a climate measure, globally, CCS has missed every target ever set for it. So 2 decades ago, the IPCC projected that by 2020, CCS could sequester up to, I think it was about 49 million tonnes per annum. No, sorry, it was more than that. It was 4 billion tonnes per annum. At most, it currently injects about 40 million tonnes per annum of CO2. And again, that's for enhanced oil recovery. The Australia Institute's actually got a report about this, which is called Sunk Cost, and you can see all the targets ever set for it and how it's missed those. Australian governments have allocated more than $4.3 billion to CCS through research, investment, development bodies dedicated to promoting CCS over the last 20 or 30 years, with the promise that it would reduce emissions from fossil fuels. Australia has one commercially operating CCS project to show for it. That's Chevron's Gorgon CO2 injection project in WA. And you're probably all aware that's been plagued with problems, and I think someone else is going to talk about that too. It's also failed to meet its storage targets. I think Jason's going to address that. So beyond the appalling waste of money with nothing to show for it, and all those obviously unabated extra tonnes of CO2 in the atmosphere, decades of funding for CCS have also seen the diversion of funding that obviously could have been dedicated to climate change mitigation. I just want to give you a quick history, basically to illustrate that this government's current policy, thinking around carbon capture and storage, is not new. It's a bad policy. It's a bad policy, and it's an old bad policy. It's not even original. So before the most recent iteration, CCS was used to sell the illusion of clean coal, which I'm sure you're all familiar with. This idea has been perpetuated for the last 20 years with obviously the unfound promise that CCS would allow coal-fired power generation to continue at the same time as reducing emissions. Just a quick history. In 2013, the Howard government funded CO2 CRC, which is a research body, or actually it's more a lobby group now, and the Low Emissions Technology Demonstration Fund. Then in 2007, Prime Minister Turnbull directed funding from the Low Emissions Technology Demonstration Fund, which is echoed in the current government's, I should say, Low Emissions Technology Roadmap in title alone. So he directed funding to coal gasification at Loy Yang. Then the Rudd Labor government continued this trend with establishing various CCS bodies, including the CCS flagship program and the National Low Emissions Coal Initiative and Global CCS Institute. Then in 2008, with the Garneau Climate Change Review, that explicitly promoted CCS as a technological solution to emissions from coal-fired electricity generation being stored, which really just legitimised the expectation that low emissions coal would continue to operate until the end of the century. If you're interested in the success of clean coal in Australia, the Australia Institute also has a report called Money for Nothing, which probably in itself gives you all the details that you need. So despite this litany of failures, CCS is experiencing a renaissance. The Australian government and the fossil fuel industry are now dedicating attention and funding for CCS to the oil and gas industry, which with the promise that CCS will reduce emissions from natural gas processing and also from fossil fuel-based hydrogen production. This is obviously to justify our enormous gas-fired recovery, but it's also to say that we're meeting and beating our targets. In 2020, the government released its Technology Investment Roadmap, which is the cornerstone of its low emissions strategy. Do you mind just going to the next slide there? Yeah, so this is the sweet little icons from the Technology Investment Roadmap. You've got clean hydrogen, and it's clean in the same way that clean coal is clean. It's not, it's fossil based with the CCS component, and highlighted there is CCS. So those are two of the priority technologies from the roadmap. Oddly, the failure record of CCS has actually been kind of banked into the Technology Investment Roadmap. It's reflected in the government's total lack of ambition for it. The roadmap itself, the whole thing, expects to abate 250 million tonnes of emissions per year by 2040, but CCS isn't even factored into it. And when government officials were asked about this, they said, oh yeah, well, we didn't expect CCS to actually store anything because it's just too variable. That was by 2040. They're expecting, hopefully it will store something after that time, but it's not even factored into a majority of the tech roadmap emissions reduction. Then funding for hydrogen under the Tech Investment Roadmap obviously benefits CCS because the clean hydrogen mentioned is produced using fossil fuels with substantial carbon capture and storage. And I'm sure you're all familiar with a study that's come out that shows that emissions associated with producing blue hydrogen from gas are actually greater than just burning the coal or gas directly. So we've got the tech roadmap. Then in 2020, well, in October this year, we have our net zero plan, or the pamphlet, the long-term emissions reduction plan. The government released this plan that accompanied the announcement of a net zero by 2050 target. The plan includes no new policies or funding to predict that with this entire policy suite that we've got, and I think policy suite is being generous, that net emissions will be reduced by 85% by 2050 on 2005 levels. It's still relying on that 40% from the tech roadmap, some of which is CCS. To be honest, it's actually barely even worth mentioning the net zero plan. There's really nothing in it. There's two pretty crazy things that I will mention though, if you don't mind going to the next slide. Oh, this is the waterfall map, graph for the net zero plan. So you can see that 40% reduction is from the tech investment roadmap. Then there's kind of vague allusions to technology trends and further technology breakthroughs. It's pretty vague. But in the next slide, if you don't mind going, this is projecting the total capacity of commercial CCS. This is projecting the capacity of storage basins in Australia. The plan highlights numerous basins for CO2 storage that are, in quotes, close to industries producing highly concentrated streams of CO2 emissions. And they've got a combined storage potential of 20 billion tonnes, which is about half all global emissions. So it's an understatement to say that it's insane. Just for context, the total capacity of commercial CCS projects globally currently is 40 million tonnes of CO2 annually, and most of those projects have never reached their storage capacity. The plan doesn't say at all how much CO2 will be stored or across what time frame. The other really weird thing about the modelling done for the plan is that it's based on something called BECCS, which is bioenergy with carbon capture and storage. So abatement in the net zero modelling document is all based around BECCS. The plan itself talks about CCS to abate emissions from fossil fuels. So the plan doesn't make a single mention of BECCS. The government's come out with a bioenergy roadmap just recently, but never at any time has BECCS factored into current CCS policies or funding. So the mechanisms, if you don't mind going to the next slide, that this government is using to facilitate CCS is clearly monstrous amounts of funding, including grants to Santos and Glencore. And this current government, and that includes state government, has committed over $1 billion to CCS just in the last couple of years. This is the funding, under current governments. If you don't mind going to the next slide. You can see the totals over the last couple of years alone. It's pretty impressive. And that just lists sort of the various funds and the way that we found these amounts. They include the announcements by government, but also things like that positive energy campaign and miscellaneous items that the Australia Institute found in AusTender. Do you mind going to the next slide? Thank you. So there's a few mechanisms that the government's using to do this. I'm going to wrap it up soon. I've just saw the time. I'm sure you're aware that the government has changed or is trying to change the mandates of public institutions to be able to channel money into CCS projects. The first one is through ARENA, which is the Australian Renewable Energy Agency. The government introduced regulations to expand the scope of projects that ARENA can fund to include clean hydrogen and CCS. ARENA was originally set up to oversee government funding for renewable energy sources. The other mechanism is through the Clean Energy Finance Corporation. You might have seen a recent announcement in the last, I think it's a week or so. The government announced $500 million as part of the creation of a $1 billion technology fund that's intending to drive drive investments to technologies such as carbon capture and storage, and that would be administered by the CEFC. The final way that the government is sort of changing public institutions or legislation is through the government's emissions reduction fund, which is a $4.5 billion fund that pays landholders and businesses to reduce their emissions. And it does this by awarding them with carbon credits the government can buy or that the government buys or that the business can sell to other businesses. So the ERF now has a method that allows carbon capture and storage projects to generate carbon offsets that gas companies can either use to offset their own emissions. So Santos could use carbon credits to offset its own emissions, or sell back to the government, or sell to, ironically, other high polluting companies. The offset method was developed very quickly by the Clean Energy Regulator. It doesn't require any long-term modelling. It grossly underestimates the risk of reversal or leakage by CCS, and it was co-designed by fossil fuel companies. Fossil fuel companies themselves, but also the government body that develops and passes legislation to recognise the method also have CCS and fossil fuel interests. So Santos is the first project to be registered under the ERF, and it's going to be capturing allegedly reservoir CO2 emissions and storing them from the Moomba gas project. Just really super quickly, You might have also heard that heard of the Indo-Pacific offsetting scheme. This is not part of the ERF, but it's informed by it. It's Australia's designing an offsetting scheme in the Indo-Pacific in conjunction with Woodside to create a supply of credits for businesses to buy. And Santos has also flagged that it will be using the Bayu-Undan gas plant or CCS project to develop quality carbon credits. It's not official, but the most obvious mechanism for this would be through the IPCOS scheme. So I think out of all the ways the federal government's perverted our public institutions to include mechanisms for oil and gas, allowing them to generate carbon credits, to me is the most obscene. So I will leave it there. I know policy is a little bit dry, but I think it's really good to give you a context so you can see what plans the government has for CCS and how your taxpayer dollars are being spent on what is just a fig leaf or a dangerous distraction to delay the inevitable shutdown of fossil fuel industries. It's continuing to stop us doing anything serious about winding down fossil fuels and to do actually anything about mitigating emissions. So that's me, Nash.
Thank you so much, Polly. That was fascinating and terrifying. And I'm one of those people that finds policy really fascinating. So I found every word fascinating. And one name that popped up a lot in your presentation was Santos. And I guess it's kind of a good segue into our next speaker, Jason Fowler, who will provide some context for what Santos proposes to do in the Northern Territory, including its proposed offshore Barossa gas field. And I'll introduce him now. He's the energy campaigner at the Environment Centre of the Northern Territory, and he's had a very long and varied background in marine conservation in Northern Australia. So he was a long-term Broome resident and marine ecologist, and he worked with Environs Kimberley defending James Price Point against the development of the world's largest LNG plant. He also worked for 6 years on the creation of the Great Kimberley Marine Park in Western Australia, and more recently he was the Marine Campaign Manager for the Australian Marine Conservation Society in the Northern Territory. Jason is an avid fisherman and yachtsman and has led dozens of expeditions with scientists and filmmakers along the coast between Broome and Darwin, and I can tell you we're very ecstatic to have Jason working with us as our energy campaigner. So over to you, Jace. You might need to take yourself off mute. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks so much, Kirsty. That's quite a raving review there. And also thanks to Polly for setting out the federal situation. I'm just going to focus on the territory itself and what's happening up here. As you can see on the photo right there, that's the Impex Ichthys LNG plant in Darwin Harbour. Just to put things in context, that's been operating for a few years now, and it produces about 5.2 million tonnes of CO2 per annum. And out in the field itself, it releases another 2 million tonnes per annum offshore. So you're talking about 7 million tonnes of CO2 being released just from that one project alone. And currently that's just literally vented off into the atmosphere. And locals in Palmerston and Darwin will tell you that there is a permanent cloud hanging over that gas plant. It's when you get up early in the morning, you drive down there, it's the first thing you see. In a clear, sunny sky, there'll be a cloud over that gas plant, just from the sheer volume of moisture and heat coming off it. Now, we asked a friend of ours, Tim Baxter from the Climate Council, to have a look at emissions in the territory and what they were like compared to other parts of the world. He got back to us with this graph, which I thought was very telling. You can see Northern Territory. Sorry, I'm just going to. You can see the Northern Territory slideshow mode is it's quite high per annum for CO2 emissions, but if we add in the Beetaloo gas field, we literally blow every other country out of the water for CO2 emissions per capita. Now, if we was to add the Barossa gas field to that as well, it would be far, far worse. So for the number of people in the territory, we are not good at CO2 emissions. Sorry, I got that sorted. So I'll move on to the next bit. So this is a big map of the Timor Sea. It's quite telling because you can see we've got the CO2 emissions the CO2 content near each gas field there. So to the left, you've got the Browse Basin. You can see the Ichthys project, which is run by Inpex, sort of 8 to 17% CO2. The Browse itself from Woodside, 10%. Prelude by Shell's a floating LNG plant out there, 9%. Then if you look at the top right-hand corner, you've got a cluster of gas fields up there, which is Evans Shoals at 27% CO2, Barossa and Caldita, Barossa being 18. And they're very, very dirty gas fields. So you sort of start to understand that we've already dug up the best of it. We're going for the bottom of the barrel stuff. We really are. And these gas fields probably should stay in the ground because they're getting very, very dirty. And I'm going to let John go into detail about that because he's far more of an expert than I am. But I just wanted to point out how we've got two gas pipelines already in place from Bayu-Undan and also from the Ichthys field. They're leading into Darwin Harbour. We've also got a gas field from the Black Tip field, which is down in the Joseph Bonaparte Gulf. That also leads into Darwin Harbour. And the Black Tip field currently supplies Darwin with gas. It's a much, much smaller field. It's a much smaller operation. And off the chart, we've got the the Beetaloo Basin fracking area, and they'll need to construct more pipelines to bring that gas up to Darwin or over east. We're not too sure yet, but what it shows is that Darwin is the epicenter of gas in Northern Australia, without a doubt. So I just wanted to show, so the NT government are really stridently pushing this middle arm sustainable development precinct at the moment. And as you can see, it's right in the middle of Darwin Harbour. It's very in plain view from Darwin and Palmerston. Now this development is at the moment, there's a business case which has been funded by the federal government and it's been led by CSIRO. There is, I think, 6 gas companies involved as well: Inpex, Santos, Woodside, ENI, and a couple of others. And it's a business case to work out how they can create a carbon capture and usage and storage hub in Darwin Harbour, because there's so much gas coming into this region. Now, if you look at this slide here, so part of this sustainable development precinct, the idea is to use the gas and the captured CO2 to develop a petrochemicals industry as well. So you're talking about very nasty plants. These are methanol, ammonia, urea, numerous petrochemical plants that produce a lot of toxic waste. And as you can see in the top right-hand corner of that slide is Palmerston. It's right there. You can see the suburbs. So I'm pretty sure that a lot of Darwin residents would not be very happy when they realise that the government is pushing hard to build a massive petrochemicals industry on their doorstep. So part of this is also to develop carbon capture and storage. We're not exactly sure how this is going to plan out because obviously the business case it hasn't been completed yet. But the land has been put aside. There's 1,500 hectares there up for grabs. They want it developed by 2030. So they're pushing pretty hard. You can see currently the 2 gas plants there, Santos LNG plant and also the Inpex Ichthys LNG plant. Just for context, Ichthys is 2 trains, Darwin LNG is 1 train. So the Darwin LNG is quite a bit smaller. So I just had to show a picture of an ammonium plant. Not a pretty sight really, and very polluting. And it's going to be a big issue in Darwin in the years to come. I'm sure a lot of locals don't want to have to deal with toxic chemicals being blown up into the air around Darwin. But anyway, I'll move on. So carbon capture and storage. So I thought I just want to explain, this is the biggest CCS project in Australia, or if not the world. It's on Barrow Island. I grew up in Broome, so to me, this is just down the road. It's in the Pilbara. Now, Barrow Island is an incredible place. It's Australia's oldest oil field. It's been running for 50 years. There's some 430 oil wells on Barrow Island. It's been tested and drilled like nowhere else in Australia. We understand the geology there probably better than anywhere else in this country. And you've got sort of three of the biggest heavyweight oil and gas companies in the world. This is Chevron, Shell, and ExxonMobil, throwing everything at it. The world's best oil and gas engineers trying to develop CCS on Barrow Island with the world's best known, or Australia's best known geology. So this is our best crack at getting it right. This project went ahead quite a few years ago now, and so far it has failed terribly. I think they've missed their targets by about 70%. So they've only managed to store a very, very small amount of CO2. The planned storage was about 3.4 to 4 million tonnes each year. So just to bring that back, remember at the start I talked about the INPEX Ichthys plant in Darwin Harbour producing, 5 billion tonnes a year and 2 million tonnes offshore, 7 million tonnes in total. And here you have Gorgon, which is an even bigger gas plant. This is 3 LNG trains. INPEX is 2, Darwin LNG is 1. So just to put it in context, enormous gas field, enormous gas plant. Right next to it, it's literally the gas plant's on Barrow Island. Right next to it is a CCS part. So there's none of this tricky, trying to pump CO2 down pipelines for miles under the sea and all this kind of tricky stuff that they want to do in the future. This is like the easiest and closest place you could possibly do it. So this is a bit of tricky geology here, but I just really needed to show this. This is what I call the Goldilocks geology. So you're looking for a chunk of earth deep down that has several layers of like seals between that formation and the surface, because you want to lock the CO2 in there somehow. The formation that you've got to use has to be fairly permeable because you need to be able to get the CO2 into it. And at the same time, it can't be too permeable, otherwise the gas will leak out. So it's sort of like the Goldilocks geology. It's very difficult to find this. Any kind of fault or crack, the gas can leak out. So it takes an incredible amount of seismic research, testing, and drilling itself to understand whether this formation will actually hold gas or not. Now, Chevron obviously leading this project. What they've done is they've set up 9 CO2 injection wells on Barrow Island. You see the picture on the left there. So the top part is where the gas plant is. Now they're injecting this CO2 deep down into this formation, but the problem is that it's full of water. So they're having to withdraw water out of the formation to allow gas to be pumped into it. Now, if they don't pull the water out quick enough and they're putting too much gas in there, obviously the pressure builds up, and this can lead to all sorts of problems with gas leaking out. You might even form cracks in the rocks. So you've got to be very careful with the pressure management system. And that's what Chevron have put a lot of work into. Now, a lot of the problems they've had is pulling the water out at the right speed and then injecting the water into another formation because they have to do something with it. So you sort of start to get an understanding of how tricky this is. It's not just a simple, oh, we're just going to shove some gas under the ground. It's nothing like that at all. It's far more complex and tricky. And I'm sure John could go into a lot more detail than me about this, but I just wanted to sort of point that out. So on the right here, you've got plume movement. So this is CO2 that's been pumped down into this Dubai formation. And this is a model to show over 65 years where the CO2 migrates to, because it does move underground. It doesn't just stay in the one spot. So the water management wells they've got there take water out, which lowers the pressure, which means the plume does move over towards those wells. So I've never seen a 1,000-year model, for example. I don't know how they can guarantee that the CO2 will stay down there forever, because I've never seen evidence to show that. But this just gives you an idea of what's involved in trying to lock CCS underground. And once again, I just reiterate, these are the biggest oil and gas companies in the world throwing everything at it. $3 billion, a big chunk of government money, the best engineers, the best geology, and we've still failed pretty badly. So there was a ray of hope. I thought, well, this happened this year. The federal government, normally they release lots of acreage in the ocean for oil and gas exploration. And this year they actually released a greenhouse gas acreage, which I thought, oh, that's interesting. That's really cool. I'll have a look at that. And so this is sort of guided by Geoscience Australia, a very good organisation, a lot of very experienced geologists in Geoscience Australia. I have a lot of respect for them. And they decided that the petrol sub-basin, which is in the Joseph Bonaparte Gulf near Darwin, is probably one of the key places to sequester CO2 under the ground. So I thought that's very interesting. So I looked at some of the geology. This is a really basic map, but it shows you the basins and some of the underlying geology. And as you can see from there, it's full of fault lines, synclines, all sorts of stuff going on. It's not simple geology at all. It's really complex. So I would suggest there's a lot of work to do there to try and figure out where you can possibly store CO2 down there. And the really interesting thing is that Santos right now are looking at storing CO2 out in the Bayu-Undan field. Now, the funny thing is that the federal government haven't identified the Bayu-Undan field as CO2 storage. They've said the petrol sub-basin. The Bayu-Undan's much, much further to the north. So that's very interesting. And I'm sure we'll hear more about that from Charles and John. But so I looked at the geology there, and then I thought, all right, so this year also, Santos decided to bring out a new seismic testing plan. So I thought, well, that's really interesting. This is actually a marine seismic survey plan for pretty much the same area where the petrol sub-basin is. And I thought, oh, fantastic. Santos are getting serious about CCS. They're actually trying to work out where to store all their carbon dioxide, which they don't know what to do with from their dirty gas fields that they want to develop. I had a glimmer of hope for a few seconds. And then I had a good look at their environmental management plan for this marine seismic survey. This was put out in July. And, you know, to quote from their management plan, the purpose of this survey, which they're going to do this wet season or summer, is to inform the exploration and development strategy for several petroleum permits and the potential location of future drilling of exploration and development wells. Oh, damn. There's not a single mention of CCS. This is about pumping more gas and oil out of the ground. I shouldn't have been led astray, but yes, quite disappointed in Santos there. I thought they're actually going to do something good, but it doesn't look like it at all. So just to end on a high note, this is quite a complex little infographic here. I'll try and explain it. It's quite difficult to get your head around, but the really big light blue circle is there's 3,000 billion tons of CO2 in the atmosphere. Now the smaller, darker blue circle is showing that we've put about 1,000 billion tons of CO2 into the atmosphere, you know, since the Industrial Revolution, probably most of it in the last 200 years or so. Now, the smaller blue circle on the left there shows that we're adding about 35 to 40 billion tons a year into that equation. So it's going up and up and up. We're not reducing that emissions yet. Now, as you just heard Polly say, currently globally, about 40 million tons is sequestered via CCS. So, you know, we're putting in 40 billion tons. We're only putting away 40 million tons. So we're like an order of magnitude away from even getting close to stopping what we're actually pouring into the atmosphere at the moment. So it clearly shows that the only way we can really get a grip on runaway CO2 and greenhouse gases is to stop producing it. And that's to stop digging it up. Because CCS is so small in scale that it's never really going to do the job. Anyway, I think that's enough from me. I'll hand over to the other two experts on the panel.
Thanks so much, Jason. That was fascinating, and I often can't believe the extent of your technical knowledge across such a breadth of areas, but that was astounding, and thank you so much. We're now going to pivot to a fascinating speaker we're very, very happy to have as part of this webinar to take us to another set of considerations, and in particular to ask the question about whether carbon capture and storage in Timor-Leste waters is carbon colonialism. And so I'll pass over to Charles Shiner, who is joining us from New York. Goodness knows what the time is. And he's been a researcher at the Timor-Leste Institute for Development Monitoring and Analysis. which is, and Lau Hamutak, which is a very well-known, independent, non-partisan Timorese civil society research organisation. And he's been working there since 2001. He specialises in the effects of oil and gas extraction on the people of Timor-Leste, including economics, governance, environment and revenue management. He's written and presented widely on Timor-Leste's experiences and advocates for sustainable and equitable policies. Because of the pandemic, he's currently working from New York and not from Dili. And so without further ado, I'll pass over to Charles.
Oh, thank you, Kirsty, and thank you also to the other speakers. I've certainly learned a lot from the two presentations so far. As you said, I worked for Lau Hamutuk, and I'm not going to repeat what you said about what we are and what we do, but we've been doing this for 20 years, since before Timor-Leste restored its independence in 2002. And it's primarily a Timorese organization, and we're independent and nonpartisan. So the people of Timor-Leste have paid dearly for other nations' wars. On December 17th, will mark the 80th anniversary of Australia's invasion of Timor-Leste, well, then Portuguese Timor, which led to the Japanese military killing 40,000 Timorese people. 10 days before that is the 46th anniversary of Indonesia's invasion and occupation, which killed more than 180,000 people in Timor-Leste. Cold War politics caused Australia, the US, and others to support this atrocity. We must not let it happen again. And the escalation of military tensions with China, as demonstrated in the recent AUKUS agreement, is worrisome. But today I'm going to talk about not the killing field in this headline, but about the garbage dump. And when we get to questions, if people have questions on any of these other things, I'm happy to talk about them as well. Timor-Leste is already experiencing the impacts of climate change. Last April, there were floods that killed 44 people and displaced 13,000. About 40% of the Timorese people live in poverty, and more than half of them depend on subsistence agriculture. Unpredictable rains and droughts make farming more challenging. The mountainous terrain and monsoonal climate cause floods and landslides, which will only get worse. Timorese people don't produce many carbon emissions. According to World Bank figures, Timor-Leste emits only half a ton of CO2 per person per year, which is about 1/9 of the world average. Each Australian, for example, or each American, actually each US person, emits about 15 tons of carbon per year, of CO2 per year. Now, the way the international community tracks this stuff, they don't hold the producer responsible for what happens when the fuel is burned. So when Timor-Leste exports its gas to Japan or its oil to other countries, and that's consumed and burned and adds more carbon to the air, that's not counted against Timor-Leste's emissions. So the numbers are a little bit misleading. However, the people of Timor-Leste will suffer much more serious consequences than the people living in rich countries. In principle, we're not opposed to carbon capture and storage once the technology is developed and it works, but it should not be used to greenwash or to justify additional emissions for oil company profits. And as the previous speaker said, net zero is basically a scam. In this slideshow and all the graphs and everything, I'm using US dollars because that's the official currency of Timor-Leste. At today's exchange rate, a US dollar is about $1.40 Australian. So since independence in 2002, Timor-Leste has received $23 billion in petroleum revenues and $9 billion from investing those revenues that haven't been spent. And $13 billion has been spent to support pretty much every government activity. But the oil is running out and the country is drawing down its savings. As you can see here, oil revenues is the green line, and it's already dropped drastically, and it will drop essentially to zero in a couple of years. But oil and gas, the area under the green line, has paid for more than 85% of government spending over the last 20 years. Timor-Leste has been one of the most petroleum export dependent countries in the world. and very little has been done to develop a non-oil economy, so that when the saved oil money in the petroleum fund runs out in about 10 years, the state budget will have to be cut by about 80%. This map shows the situation before the 2018 Maritime Boundary Treaty, which I noticed Jason's map also showed this area. It's no longer the case, but at that time, this polygon in the middle was a joint revenue sharing area that had been agreed in 2002, but Australia refused to accept the maritime boundary until Timor-Leste brought it into international, compulsory international conciliation, which led to a maritime boundary agreement that finally came into effect in August 2019. Before that, the history is that Australia basically continued the Indonesian occupation of Timor-Leste and prioritized its greed for Timor-Leste's oil resources over its respect for the country's sovereignty. But in 2019, as I said, the Maritime Boundary Treaty was signed, and it established this line, the white and purple line, as the maritime boundary between the two countries. In the time before that, Australia collected about $5 billion in oil and gas revenues from oil and gas fields that it now agrees are in Timor-Leste's territory. Basically, Laminaria, Carolina, Buffalo, Bayu-Undan, and a few smaller ones. Australia, under the treaty, Australia gets to keep that money, and Timor-Leste's government is not even allowed to talk about it. During that same period, Bayu-Undan paid $21 billion to Timor-Leste and a little over $2 billion to Australia. But it's almost used up. And in the time after the boundary treaty came into effect, Timor-Leste will receive less than 1 billion more from that field. And Australia no longer gets a 10% cut. So that 100 million that Australia gives up is a small price to pay for international legitimacy and for avoiding responsibility of cleaning up Bioindent after it's used up. This other field, Laminaria Carolina, Woodside began extracting oil from Laminaria Carolina in 1998 and has paid more than $2 billion in revenues to Canberra. In 2017, when the field was no longer profitable, Woodside sold it to a new company called Northern Oil and Gas Australia, which got cited many times for violating environmental regulations and then went bankrupt. And so now Australian taxpayers and possibly Australian oil companies will have to pay more than $200 million to decommission this project. The white parts of the treaty line, particularly this one, are provisional, and it may be rotated this way to put Laminaria Carolina in Timor-Leste territory after Laminaria Carolina is no longer viable, no longer commercially viable, which is already the case, and after Timor-Leste settled its maritime boundary with Indonesia. But there was testimony in a Senate hearing, Australian Senate hearing a few weeks ago that said Australia should give Laminaria Carolina to Timor-Leste now, even though it's dirty and leaking and will cost a huge amount of money to clean up. So we hope that that's not, that suggestion is not taken seriously. I'm not going to go into length about this, but these are possible projects or currently under development projects, excluding Bayu-Undan. 4 of them are far enough along to make reasonable estimates about how much money they can generate for Timor-Leste, and they total about $1.3 billion US, which is as much as Timor-Leste received in 3 months in 2012. It's about enough to cover Timor-Leste's state budget for 1 year, but it's certainly not a long-term solution. In early 2018, before the maritime boundary was agreed, so now we're back to this revenue sharing agreement. This is a map from ConocoPhillips, and they were planning to pipe Barossa gas to run into the Bioindent pipeline to the LNG plant that Jason showed us pictures of at Wickham Point in Darwin. They knew that Bioindent was almost empty and that the LNG plant and the pipeline would be unused. And they expected or hoped to save money, capital investment on developing Barossa by using the existing pipeline and the existing LNG plant. They didn't pay any attention at all to carbon or climate change implications. In 2019, ConocoPhillips decided to get out of the area, and they sold Barossa, Bayu-Undan, the pipeline, and Darwin LNG, all of which they were the largest owner of in the joint ventures. They sold it all to Santos. And Santos is continuing the same plans that ConocoPhillips had. And again, there was no mention of carbon capture or anything related to carbon until last May of this year. So the Bioindent plant has already produced more than 99% of the revenues it will produce for Timor-Leste. And that gas, as I said, is piped to Darwin, liquefied, and shipped to Japan since 2006. Santos is currently drilling 3 more wells at Bayu-Undan to suck up the last drops of oil and gas. But the cost of those wells will probably absorb all of the money they would have generated for Timor-Leste. So they don't produce anything for Timor-Leste, but they allow the Darwin LNG plant to keep running until Barossa comes online. That's the real reason that they're doing this. And then after Bayu-Undan is empty, Santos plans to use the pipeline and the LNG plant for Barossa. And like ConocoPhillips, they realize they can save billions of dollars in capital costs. I won't go into this at length, but the 3 gas fields up here, as Jason said, are very high CO2 content. And so that in order to develop them, Santos, which has Barossa and Caldita, and ENI, which has Evan Shoal, need to find a way to do something about the CO2 so that they can continue to add more methane into the environment. The companies, if they do work this out and they do develop these fields, the companies will make profits. Australia will get economic and tax benefits. The earth will get warmer, and Timor-Leste will get the waste and the responsibility to keep it out of the atmosphere forever. Last week, Energy Voice, in an article, actually, I think written by somebody who's on this call, reported that Abadi, which is a similar gas field just across the Indonesian border from Barossa, will probably not be developed. So the plan by Santos and ENI, they talk about storing 10 million tons per year of CO2 in the Bayu-Undan field once it's depleted. That's equal to about 1/39th of the CO2 emitted by Australia in 2018, which is the latest figures I could find. But if you compare it with Timor-Leste's emissions, it's 16 times more carbon dioxide than the entire country of Timor-Leste emitted in 2018. So this will help the companies in Australia claim net zero when they continue to develop Barossa and Evan Shoal, and it will allow them to delay the cost of decommissioning Bayu-Undan and restoring it to some kind of safe condition. So even if Australian government doesn't subsidize this project because it's outside of Australian territory, the companies will get the advantage of looser environmental and operational regulation, and they'll be out of sight of the Australian government and the Australian people. So last September, Santos signed an MOU with Timor-Leste's petroleum regulator to continue to develop this project. It's moving very fast. Just a couple of weeks ago, the head of Santos gave a speech at an oil industry conference in Darwin. And he said, I'm not going to read, this is an excerpt from the speech, you can read it if you want, I'm not going to read the whole thing, but the thing that's important to notice is last sentence, that this whole carbon capture project is justified by unlocking other gas resources in the region, all of the dirty fields that Jason was telling us about. And it's also worth noting that your taxes, the CSIRO, Australian Government Science Agency, is working with Santos on this project. At the climate change conference in Glasgow, the ANPM was the Timor-Leste petroleum regulator was finally able to meet with Santos's CEO and talk about this. They've been trying to get a meeting here, and the head of the ANPM put on LinkedIn, it's ironic that as close neighbors, we had to do this on the other side of the world. Unfortunately, the Timor-Leste government needs money, and it's become addicted to easy rents from the petroleum industry. The proposed CCS project, even though there's never been any talk about how much Santos is going to pay to store the carbon in Timor-Leste, will inspire more fantastic dreams of manna from heaven. We don't know how long Santos will be responsible or what happens after that. Santos, ENI, and Australia hope to exploit an impoverished neighbor whose people, including Timorese decision makers, have limited technical, environmental, and numerical skills and experience. Almost nobody in Timor-Leste's government talks about this within the country. It's hardly been in the local media. But I think if people knew about it, they would not want Timor-Leste to import Australia's waste. And they would be appalled at being used to justify further destruction of the climate. And just one thing I realized from Jason's talk is this project is underwater. This is, Bayu-Undan is 200 meters below the surface of the Timor Sea. So it's even more difficult than Barrow and the Mumba and the other places where at least you can see what's going on. So please help us ground this discussion in reality and help Timor-Leste and Australia to go down this, not to go down this ill-fated path. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Charles. That was an extraordinary presentation, so sobering. And as Hannah has commented in the chat, it's so important to hear a global environmental justice perspective on this issue. And I think even 20 years ago in Darwin, we were there was a hotbed of East Timorese activism, and there were such close connections with that place. And I feel in some ways that's been lost. And it's just, we're so grateful to have you here to remind us of this terrible history of the Australian exploitation, frankly, of the oil reserves of other people and its plan to dispose of its waste in the waters once they've been, or in the underground once the resource has been exploited. So thank you again. We'll now I'll pass over to our last speaker, John Robert. And we will have a Q&A at the end, and I've been taking notes of all of your questions. Thank you so much. So John has a background in petrochemical engineering and operations, business development and project development with an international engineering contractor, methanol and LNG project developments for independent oil and gas companies, and gas to liquids and biodiesel project developments over more than 40 years. He recently authored a report on the Barossa Carbon Capture and Storage Project for the Institute for Energy Economics and Finance Analysis. And again, we're just so ecstatic to have your expertise as part of this webinar, John, and I'll pass over to you now. Let me know if you've got a problem with sharing your screen, because I've got your presentation as a backup.
Thank you very much, Kirsty. I'll just get this shared. Thank you very much, and for a kind introduction. And I would like to acknowledge that I'm speaking to you from the traditional lands of the Wurundjeri people in the Kulin Nation around Melbourne, and pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. Now, I'm trying to make my, oh yeah, there we go. Firstly, yes, the agenda. So I think we've had a fairly good description of CCS and how it may or may not work. So I'll move on fairly quickly, and I'll apologise in advance for the some technical content in my presentation, but I'll try and simplify it and be happy to answer questions afterwards, of course. So just moving on, carbon capture storage. It's easy to say, but not necessarily very easy to do. The first C, of course, is carbon, a form of gas, carbon dioxide. Second is for capture, means separating carbon dioxide from the mixture that it might otherwise be heading for the atmosphere. And S stands for storage for a very long time, so it stops heating up the earth and mucking up the climate. But in between, and not mentioned in that glib acronym, in between capture and storage, there's compression, transport, re-injection, all of which are not trivial in engineering and cost and risk and other terms. The S in storage has been mentioned a little bit, but there was a nice graphic here provided by or available on the website of the Global CCS Institute. On the right-hand side is the overview, and let's see, I have to move, yes. So I've highlighted with a yellow rectangle depleted oil and gas reservoirs are where the focus is, particularly in Australia, because we don't have too many saline formations, I don't think, or various other things, the other options, 1, 2, 3, where you might store it. But of course, a lot of the work that has been done in this is, or some claimed achievements of CCS has actually been under the commercial driver of enhanced oil recovery, as I think has been mentioned. But here's another nice sheet I think I got from the presentation at CEOC a couple of weeks ago from the CRC for covering the CO2. And it points out that there's a big difference in capture between concentrated CO2 streams and dilute ones. Natural gas processing, which would include the front end of LNG plants, is the obvious one. It's pretty concentrated CO2 as you get from ammonia and some other processes. But unfortunately, it's only about 10% of global emissions. So, but that is the one which is cheap to store, because you've got to add a bit of compression and find a good site to put it down. A few other complications we've heard about and we'll hear a little more about. But that's cheap compared to from coal and gas to power. That is power station exhausts, or smokestacks, whatever you like to call them, very dilute. You know, there's an awful lot of nitrogen and water vapor and some oxygen and things which complicate the chemistry and thermodynamics. But that's 90% of emissions. So billions have been spent over the last 20-something years around the world, and not least in Australia, researching how to do that step particularly. But still, it's a very high premium to actually make that work. And you know, there's really not a practical concept or a process that's usable, you know, post combustion. But LNG is, you know, a bit of a subtopic today, and so I thought I should explain a little bit where emissions come from in an LNG plant. So there's a few blocks here, so bear with me for a little bit. But there's gas wells, the condensate's separated, a little bit of fuel goes off to the utilities area. Trying to move my mouse, there we go. Where you have to burn some of it for power to drive the rest of the business. And then there's an acid gas removal unit, and this makes this is where nearly pure CO2 is separated from the largely methane that's going on to be turned into LNG, and that is vented because it's the cheapest, easiest way to do it. So that's what they've done traditionally in a lot of places around the world in gas processing, and particularly in LNG plants. And of course, the more CO2 is in the gas that you're pulling out of those wells, not 1 or 2%, but 18%, that means there's an awful lot has to be thrown away in that pure form. But anyway, there's the liquefaction. There's a few other stages I won't go into, but the point is that the two forms of emissions of CO2, you know, can be separated from pre-combustion, but post-combustion, that's sort of a weak purple because it's pretty dilute in terms of CO2 and pretty impractical to capture that CO2. So why is it being proposed for the Northern Territory? I think this has been said a little bit. The lower CO2 content gas reservoirs have been consumed. Well, it really applies to the Northwest Shelf, where they started off with about 2 or 3% CO2. But here at the 6% and about 9% on average, feeding the Darwin LNG plant and then the Ichthys Inpex plant, respectively. But there's new projects being proposed to continue producing LNG for export. So notably, the current one of the day, Barossa at 18%, volume percent. Mind you, if you convert that to weight percent, so tons of CO2 per tonne of methane, basically, you can double it up. It's about 36% CO2, in fact. And then 28% volume. I mean, that's just, you know, if you think Barossa is bad, Evan Shoal really is another one that should stay in the ground for sure. But all that, and at the same time, you know, LNG producers are coming under pressure from their customers, their shareholders, and particularly, you know, when they're exporting to North Asia, where Korea and Japan, and even China are, you know, beginning to signal that they won't be taking too much coal, but, you know, if they're going to buy gas, they're going to want to buy low CO2 gas before it gets to them and they burn it. So Santos, ENI and INPEX are working on CCS schemes to share some of their emissions, and in the hope that increasing the scale may reduce the unit costs, which theoretically it would, and sharing the cost and the blame if it all goes wrong. But if you thought the last block flow diagram was complicated, I'm sorry I have to show you this one, but this is the Barossa thing because it's an uncommonly complex LNG plant. It's got two operating centres, both of which use some of the gas that they're receiving to run utilities and emit dilute CO2. And then they both have a chopper pulling out a bit of acid gas. And this is in the proposal as put and approved by ConocoPhillips in 2018 in their offshore project proposal, like an EIS. So that's what's been approved. And they were going to remove CO2 in one step to go from 18% down to 6%, because that's what the plant in Darwin it was designed to handle. So it's got, there's two sources, a concentrated one and a dilute one offshore on the floating production storage and offload unit. And then again, when the last bits of it are removed and again vented in Darwin, but also where some 6% gas is burnt, producing more. So that's a bit of the ugly picture. We've seen you've got an idea of the layout, I guess, Barossa Caldita here. In my recent paper that was published by EFA, I just heard announcements that they were considering or planning to change the approved plan and do CCS. So I figured that the obvious thing was to put a pipeline across there direct from Barossa to Bayu-Undan at 430 kilometres, so that that complicates things a lot, and that's what I wrote about partly in my study. But turns out they're going to do something else, which actually isn't any better, but to leave 18% gas and run it all the way down to Darwin, and then separate it all together there, put in another bit of pipeline so they can get out to Bayu-Undan. There's a few other complications to that. But here's the summary of the paper that I did recently, showing scenario A is for the offshore project proposal, the four sources of CO2 and the total in the final column on the right at the top line shows 1.47. That's there's nearly 1.5 tons of CO2 emitted for every ton of LNG that's produced. And I, perhaps naively, but assume, going the direct way from, as I've just described, they could eliminate the major vent by sending it down to Bioindent, but they'll have to compress it to turn it into liquid. Apart from building the pipeline, they'll have to put more compression on that FPSO. So the combustion emissions go up. The vent in Darwin would still be too small to bother taking out to Bayu-Undan. Combustion would be the same. It's not much of a reduction. It's still more than 1 tonne of CO2 for every tonne of LNG. The Australian average, by the way, is 0.7, and that includes Ichthys and Gorgon and various others. So I volunteered a nice bit of pre-engineering for them to say you do better off, mate, electrifying it all. You'd need to, I haven't tried to estimate costs of that, but you could do it with cables like they're doing to offshore platforms in Norway and have been doing for some time to reduce emissions in processing offshore, where they've got green, hydro green power. And that would make a significant difference, even if you didn't bother to CCS the little vent in Darwin. But what we've learned recently from Santos is that they're going to do something different. They're not going to vent any CO2 offshore. You might think that's doing us a favour. It certainly provides a bit more real estate on the floating vessel, which they've started building already. And perhaps they figured they would need more. But they certainly will use some of that spare real estate to put extra compression in, because they've got to move a couple of tons of a million tons a year of CO2 down the pipeline to Darwin. And I don't think they're going to change the size of that pipeline. So it'll take a bit more compression out on the platform, which means more emissions. And they're all the time, they're burning 18% CO2 gas in that. A gas-fired power station connected to the grid in Australia, and I think in the US, operates on it with about 2% CO2 in the methane coming to it. And then it emits more, obviously, when the methane is burnt. But when it's 18% already, you're putting out a fair bit. Anyway, the acid gas removal unit at Darwin is inadequate. They'd have to build 2 more like that. And then that pure CO2 have to be compressed, so more energy to go out to Bayu-Undan. And of course, when you've got 3 of those acid gas plants running, they demand a fair bit of the energy. So these are bigger than in the previous diagram I showed you. Okay, so away from diagrams, I only know diagrams and lots of words, I'm sorry. But Santos, hasn't really indicated in any detail at all what changes it plans to make to the approved approval they received for this project. So they're starting 15% of the way down an unapproved project, as far as if we can believe the CEO at CEOC 2 weeks ago. Adding CCS to it will significantly change the emissions profile in various ways, as yet unknown to the public. The largest portion, as I've said, is from, there's about 8 or 10% of the gas coming from the wells is traditionally burnt as fuel to make the whole thing work. And they're only planning in their CCS scheme to store the CO2 separated from the gas to be liquefied. It's about 40% of the emissions, according to their OPP description. That is in this table, the 1.8 and the 0.5, so 2.3 out of 5.4. But when you allow for, if they're going to do that with all the extra compression, and I haven't worked out detail, energy needs for that, but I'm, my experience tells me they're going to be making using a whole lot more fuel gas and using all high CO2 gas as fuel gas. So they'll only make about a 30% reduction in what it'll be. It's crazy. So higher CO2 gas would be delivered to Darwin under their plan, but they'll produce more there. And then there's a new pipeline required through the harbour to carry the captured CO2 at Darwin LNG plant, and I think they're hoping to get maybe if they could collaborate sufficiently with INPEX, and if they could maybe if E&I crazily were ever to get approval for their Evans Shoal development, they would certainly want to put all that together and put it out through that line, and there would be some economies of scale, but it won't matter, shouldn't happen. But in the meantime, once they do this, gas production will have to be maintained at Bayu-Undan to supply the energy to recompress the CO2, because when it comes as liquid 500 kilometres from Darwin, having already travelled 300 kilometres from the wells at Barossa, they're going to have to recompress it to re-inject it at like 200 atmospheres pressure into the depleted gas reservoirs. And by the way, they say they know that gas reservoir pretty well because they've been operating it for 20 years. Well, it didn't, those sort of decades of previous operational experience obviously hasn't helped Gorgon all that much, Chevron. So CCS adds costs, delays, risks and uncertainties to any development, as Chevrons have found to their cost at Gorgon. And only a minor portion of the total emissions will be captured and stored. And Barossa, even when they do that, as I think their implied plan is, Barossa LNG will still likely be the dirtiest LNG made in Australia and probably globally. And of course, the CCS may not work. So Santos must make their development intentions clear and seek approvals for a very different project. The LNG industry is traditionally very conservative. So why is it taking on such a risky thing as CCS? As I said, I gave them a free kick, I guess, in my report with IEFA, but electrification, particularly with low-cost solar and wind power, as may well be available in Northern Australia and going through Darwin if the Sun Cable project moves on. Electrification is much less risky and much more effective at reducing emissions at CCS if you're using renewable energy as you would. So if it's going to go ahead, I think the development of the CCS business theoretically should occur in parallel, not to follow and fail some years later, as has happened at Gorgon. A new approval, if there is such, should ban exports of Barossa gas as LNG until the CCS system is proven to be working, not have a 3 or 5 year gap, as happened with Gorgon, if it can be said to be working satisfactorily now. We can't have another repeat of the Gorgon debacle. And just to finish, I'm sorry I'm taking a lot of time, but this is a quote from Simon Holmes Accord. Carbon capture and storage, a favourite of Australian governments for decades, remains a distraction. First, since CCS adds significant cost but no benefit to a process, it will always require either a carbon price or regulations to be viable. And second, while CCS may play a role at the margins in areas where emissions are hard to abate, such as cement production, its only significant role for coal and gas is as a fig leaf for inaction. Thank you.
Thanks so much, John. That was exceptional. And somehow you've managed to make your presentation both highly technical and really hard hitting. And we might just leave that slide up at the end, particularly with that line at the bottom, a fig leaf for inaction, because that's certainly the impression that I leave this webinar with. And I want to thank all of our speakers. I've certainly learned a lot, and we've had incredible participation in this webinar, showing just the level of interest in understanding exactly what is being promised by this technology and what it will and won't deliver. So thank you for all of your incredible expertise and insights into this complex topic. We're now going to move on to a Q&A session. People have been putting in questions into the chat and into the Q&A box, and I've taken notes of those, and I'll just ask them myself if that's okay. And I'm actually going to start by using my moderator's privilege and asking a question that hasn't been put in the chat, but it is actually a question that we have. For instance, Jason was asked this question in a recent interview on the ABC. This is the position that's put by bureaucrats who we speak to when we question carbon capture and storage. And I'm going to pass over to Polly to answer it first up, and then perhaps move on to Jason and John. But the question is this: shouldn't gas companies be encouraged to reduce their emissions, including through developing new technologies like carbon capture and storage? So the implication is that this is a good, benign thing. And Polly, what's your response to that?
Gas companies should be encouraged to reduce their emissions by not producing gas anymore. That would be the best way to do it. They're not paying for the CCS. Taxpayer is currently the one paying for the CCS. So sure, if gas companies were footing the bill, which they never would, it might be a viable option. But just two things there. gas is not a transition fuel. We've been talking about it as a transition fuel since the 90s. This government is not even approaching it as a transition fuel. It's locking it in to 2050 and beyond, both domestically and for export. And CCS is not. Sorry, was someone talking to me? No, sorry, I'll keep going. CCS is not a new technology. It's been around since the 70s as well. It just doesn't work. At some point you have to accept the fact that this doesn't work. It is a fig leaf. It's a dangerous distraction. The IEA has said there could be no new coal or gas or oil projects if the energy sector is going to reach net zero by 2050. Like, we actually don't even need to be having this conversation about CCS. It maybe has, John and Jason would know better than me, maybe it has a role to play for not producing or expanding fossil fuels. Jason showed us with Gorgon that Gorgon produces 56 million tonnes of life cycle emissions per year. Correct me if that figure is not quite right. It's only stored 5 million tonnes. Even if it worked, any CCS attached to gas only ever captures a fraction of reservoir emissions. You've still got all the fugitive emissions from extraction and production, and then you've got all the emissions from combustion. So CCS is never going to ever make a gas project net zero or carbon neutral.
Thanks, that makes it very clear. I'll pass on now to Jace to offer his insights and yeah, thoughts on that question.
It's hard to follow on from Polly. Yeah, I think, you know, we have existing industries like cement production, steel refineries, etc. We definitely should capture the CO2. I can't see how we can really get around that. It really pains me to drive on the way down to Palmerston every morning and I see a massive cloud over that Impacts gas plant. And I know that's just millions of tons of CO2 pouring out into the atmosphere. That should definitely be captured. I have no doubt at all. Or not run the plant, you know, make the decision either way. And I totally agree with Polly, like these new fields, you just saw this morning, Woodside announced they're going to develop the Scarborough gas field off the Pilbara coast. This thing is enormous. It's going to run to 2063, I think I read. And that gas field certainly should not go ahead unless they can prove every single drop of CO2 is captured and, you know, stored appropriately. Otherwise, we're just going down the wrong path. Yeah, I'll just leave it at that.
Great. John, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, well, I haven't got much to add, except I should mention, and I don't want to contradict you, Jason, there, but the Scarborough, to its credit at least, is only 0.1% CO2 in the reservoir. So, you know, if you really have to do it, that would be all right, you know, okay, but it wouldn't be, I mean, it's a whole lot better than the dirty gas, you know, in Barossa and even Shoal. But on the other hand, you know, I'm generally in agreement, well, very much in agreement. But as Polly said that, you know, and I think the CCS is a bit like when the tobacco industry invented menthol cigarettes. You know, it's not going to improve your health anyway. It's a different thing, and it's something we talked about and promoted. And we're in the full promotion phase right now, obviously, for CCS.
Great, thank you so much. The next question came from the chat, and I'm going to put this one to Charles and Jason. And it's a really good question, a really important question. But how can we work better to support the people of Timor-Leste, but also First Nations people who are affected by these projects and by climate change itself, to support their rights and concerns about protecting their land and seas? So, Charles, you know, we're here, sitting here in Darwin on Larrakia country and all over the nation, listening to the powerful presentation that you gave, and what can we do is the question.
Yeah, it's a challenge, and I forgot to say that I'm in Lenape country here in New York, that Americans are not as good as Australians at acknowledging whose land we're living on, but thank you for reminding me to do that. I was very active in the solidarity movement for Timor-Leste in the 90s. And I remember once asking Jose Ramos Horta, what should we do as ETAN in the United States to support your struggle for self-determination? And his answer was, you know your country much better than I do. And you know what strategies will work and what's the most effective thing that can be done to influence your government. So, I mean, Barossa, if it goes ahead and whatever deal Santos makes with the Timor-Leste authorities is going to be approved either tacitly or officially by Australia. And if the Australian government tells Santos, no, you can't do this, it's not going to happen. But I'm not Australian. I've been there a number of times. I've been to Darwin. I like Darwin, but I can't tell you how to influence the Australian government not to go down this wrong path. I mean, I think everybody else on this webinar knows that better than I do.
Great answer. Thank you. Thanks, Charles. And Jason, this is something that we at the Environment Centre think about all the time. Sometimes we do it well, sometimes we don't. We're not a First Nations organisation, and I do want to shout out to First Nations organisations doing this incredible work of organising on the ground, including in the Northern Territory, particularly SEED, Original Power, and Get Up's First Nations campaigning arm led by Larissa Baldwin. So just shout out to their incredible work in relation to fracking the Beetaloo and a range of projects across Australia. But yeah, Jason, how do we do this work of supporting and showing solidarity with First Nations people in our work and helping them to protect their country?
Yeah, good question there, Kirsty. Literally this afternoon, I just flew back from the Tiwi Islands. I've done 2 big trips over there, talking to different clan groups. Today, I literally presented to a packed room with at least 100 people from the Malu clan, which is on Bathurst Island. And it really struck me that this Barossa plan has been around since 2017. The work on it's been happening well before then. And yet there I am as the first person that tells them about that. They had no idea it even existed, but until I came along and said, have you seen this? I think that the consultation process conducted by ConocoPhillips and Santos is a complete failure, without a doubt. I have not met a single Tiwi Islander that knows anything about this project in any kind of detail at all. And from what I can see, that's certainly not the right way to do business, and it may actually even break regulations. Because, I mean, it's a very hard thing to quantify, of course. The Tiwi Islanders, they live on that coast. They fish out there all the time. It's critically important to them. And they're horrified when they understand a massive gas pipeline and ships and helicopters and the whole industrialization of their coast, you know, next door. They really are gearing up to fight this and try and stop it. So for us up here, I mean, obviously, the Northern Territory is a very big place. So it's critical for us to work with First Nations people, and we do it routinely now.
Great, thanks so much. I'm now going to move on to some questions that have come through on the subsidies question. And I guess I just want to say that the Northern Territory's very existence is predicated on subsidies, mainly from the Commonwealth government. And that, you know, I guess to many people in the Territory, the prospect of getting money funneled into the Territory for something, anything, even if it's connected with gas, is viewed as a positive thing. But we had some questions about how much funding Santos and other companies are receiving or have received for CCS. And also the sort of flip side to that question is private capital flowing into CCS in any material sense, or is it predominantly being made feasible through public subsidies? So, you know, how I know, Polly, you've sort of spoken about this, but how dependent on public subsidies is this particular technology and its implementation?
I should just clarify how the CCS at Moomba is going to work, but it's so most recently they got a $15 million grant, sort of a feasibility grant by the federal government to see if they could get their CCS up and running. The Santos Moomba project is not new. Santos has been talking about it since 2007. It abandoned plans in 2009 because it couldn't get government funding for the initial phase, which was going to cost around 700 million. So I guess it just shows that these things don't go ahead without millions of dollars in public funding. I'm not sure how much Santos has received more generally just for its CCS. The Australian government gave $10.3 billion in fossil fuel subsidies last year alone. So that sort of shows you how big they are generally. The way that the funding for the Moomba CCS project works is through the Emissions Reduction Fund. So the project is registered without any upfront capital, apart from that $15 million grant, which was for a separate body of money. But what happens is that Santos or Moomba stores the reservoir CO2 emissions. They reckon they can store 1.7 million tonnes a year. And for each tonne they store, they're issued a carbon credit. And they either sell that carbon credit back to the Australian government, or they can sell it to a private business that wants to offset its own emissions. So in terms of its CCS earning carbon credits, I think that was one of the questions too. The way the public money is coming is through the purchase of carbon credits later. So I can't actually tell you how much they're receiving for that or will receive. I mean, realistically, they're not going to store anything. So it's moot, but symbolically, it's appalling.
Thanks so much. John, is there anything you wanted to add to that?
Yes, thank you, Kirsty. The other thing is that Santos Moomba, I was working for the engineering company that built that facility in late 70s, late 60s. So from about 1970, they've been having to reduce the CO2 from 16%, it was the original field CO2 content, down to 2% to put it in the pipeline to supply gas to Adelaide and Sydney, which means, and when you ever see photos of the Moomba plant, you can see there's 6 or 7 big towers with a big pipe open-ended on the top of it. Sometimes if it's taken early in the morning, there's a little plume of steam because it has, it's got about 0.5% of water in it, which in a cold winter's morning would show up as some steam or cloud. But they've been venting 1 or 2 million tonnes a year ever since then. And they probably did start with the lowest CO2 gas they could find, although it's pretty random. But, I think I've seen reports recently that, they've got 20% and other pretty high levels of CO2. So that's all been thrown into the sky. They've been doing that, making money on it since 1970. And they want the government to pay for a plant. I mean, I'm just staggered really to hear that. And, it shouldn't happen.
Mm.
And one other thing, sorry if I may, how is it going to help? It's not going to do anything for the Barossa project. They're not going to pipe CO2 2,500 kilometres down to Moomba to take less than what Barossa would be emitting in a concentrated, almost feasibly condition to to inject into somewhere around Moomba. So, it just amazes me how they can hold themselves up as doing us all a favour by getting paid for it when they've been causing the problem for 30 years.
Thanks, John. I actually have another question for you that's quite technical, but others may be able to answer it as well. Someone said, is it true that pumping gas into subterranean structures can yield earthquakes? Can it erode the seals, breach the integrity of wells so that carbon dioxide can leak through? There seem to be many leakage mechanisms that scientists aren't aware of. And it's sort of struck, that's I like that question because there's been a whole debate for years in the Northern Territory about the re-injection of wastewater into fracking wells, and it's been banned because it's a risky practice. And an activist said to me recently, isn't it the same thing? And I guess, you know, from a technical perspective, what are the dangers associated with this, with re-injecting CO2 deep underground?
Yeah, well, I've worked alongside a number of good petroleum scientists, you know, geoscientists, but I can't claim to have their expertise, so I'm not too sure about that. But I know that, you know, there's a lot of seismic work, you know, it needs to be done before you could find anywhere to re-inject, as you probably all accept and understand. But it's the thing is that what concerns me is monitoring it. You know, I think there's about 1 million tonne a year been going in the North Sea, under the North Sea. I think it's the Sleipner project, or there's another one from the. Yeah. Anyway, there's a significant seismic monitoring program. So they're, you know, looking at all and getting. You know, monitoring, I don't know how often they do it, once a year or whatever, to watch where the plume of CO2 is going. So I think we saw, was it in Jason's, one of the images Jason showed with the plumes predicted in 20 years' time. So, you know, they can monitor that and see where if it's approaching a point where the geology has told them, you know, there is a fracture line here, or there's a discontinuity, or the fill point will be reached, or whatever. And so they can monitor that. It costs something to do the seismic, and of course, whatever it costs around Moomba, it costs about 10 times as much to do it around Bayu-Undan, because you've got to use a vessel and all the costs associated with doing that. So, and it's not a, you know, it's not too hard when it's 150 100 or 50 kilometres off the Norwegian coast, but it's a different thing with offshore monitoring in the Timor Sea.
Fascinating. Look, it's now, we've been going for a long time, an hour and 40 minutes. So we might bring this webinar to a close. I just wanted to thank sincerely our panellists. It's been an extraordinary discussion, and I'm sure everyone has learnt a lot. So our speakers today have been Polly Hemming, Jason Fowler, Charles Shiner, and John Robert. I have just shared, I hope, our Stop Barossa Gas campaign that we're doing in collaboration with a bunch of different organisations, not just in Australia, although we do have Australian partners, but also with Japanese and South Korean partners. And if you click on that link, you'll be taken to a wealth of information about this project. And also, because the Environment Centre of the Northern Territory is small and underfunded, also and we're reliant on donations and private grants. If you feel so inclined and you want to support our Barossa campaign, you can always go onto our website and donate there, or become a regular giver, or become a member, or just sign up for our regular updates. But yeah, with that, I'd just like to say thank you all again. It's been incredibly informative, and yes, we look forward to seeing where CCS goes in Australia, if indeed it goes anywhere. So thanks all.
Thank you.
Thanks.